So as I usually say, good evening, boa noite, everyone. Welcome back to our series, Brazil, 100 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. The topic this week is O Samba da Minha Terra, the Samba of My Land, a review of Brazilian musics and their connection with the African continent and its diaspora. Presenting is Sean Samad. He's a Ph.D. candidate in cultural studies and an adjunct lecturer in cultural studies and Brazilian studies at the University of the West Indies St Augustine campus. And I am your host. My name is Marco Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. This presentation is part of a series of workshops, presentations, and discussions presented by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. So welcome all, and especially welcome Sean Samad. Well, Sean Samad was already here with us before, but as I said, he is a PhD candidate in cultural studies and adjunct lecturer. And apart from that, he is a Caribbean Brazilianist, and he has studied at the USP, which is the Universidade de São Paulo, and engaged Brazilian culture since 1999. And he's one of the co-founders of A Alma Brasileira, a concert series in Trinidad and Tobago that mentored local artists to perform Brazilian music there. So his PhD work focuses on the socio-cultural conditions that impact the work of music composers who create music for carnivals in Trinidad and in Salvador da Bahia in Brazil. So once again, we are very happy to have you here today, Sean. And we even had a guest that was requesting your presence here tonight to talk about Brazilian music. And I thought you would be the right person to do that. So Sean, first of all, you're my Facebook friend, right?
Yes.
And your name there is not Sean Samad, it's Sean Samba.
Correct.
I wonder how come.
It was actually an error. It was actually a typo. So it wasn't strategic or anything, because my last name is Samad, S-A-M-A-D, and Samba is S-A-M-B-A. And somehow, I don't know, it got switched up into Samba, and I just liked how it sounded, so I left it that way.
I think it's a very happy coincidence that it happened, that this mistake happened.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so Sean, I will give over to you. So today you will talk about Brazilian music, the African influence, and what that has to do also with us here in the Caribbean, the similarities. I guess you will do that. And I also guess we will have some questions from the audience at the end. So
Sure.
I'll give over the floor to you so you can share, and let's see. We are waiting for your presentation anxiously.
I'm going to turn off my camera just so that the bandwidth is...
Okay, so I think I will do the same here so we have a better connection. Yeah, there we go.
Just trying to get it to present. So I want to start off by saying that when Marco first asked me to present on Brazilian music, I was a bit worried because usually when I teach Introduction to Brazilian Culture at the University of the West Indies, it takes me 2 weeks to just do a survey of Brazilian music. So I thought it was a huge challenge to try and hyper focus on the key parts or the important parts, the important elements of Brazilian music in 1 hour. So I hope I do it justice. I don't know why this is.
Yeah, we know very well what it means. So yeah, I understand your challenge.
I don't know why this is not present. Okay, here we go. So are you seeing like notes and stuff on the side too?
We are not seeing notes, probably just you that's seeing notes.
Okay. So welcome everyone. The presentation is going to be a review of Brazilian musics and their connection with the African continent and diaspora. I'm not going to go into a lot of theoretical depth about the connection with Africa, but I will do a kind of introduction to that. And I think just the music will speak for itself and illustrate that connection. So let's jump into it. So I'm going to give a little introduction into what Brazilian music is and what it has been for people in and outside of Brazil. Give a little historical perspective on the roots of Brazilian music, and then I'm going to try to cover some key genres of Brazilian music that have come to characterize what Brazilian music it means and what it is, both internally and externally. So lots of people have talked about Brazilian music and what it stands for. Herbie Mann, who's the famous jazz flautist, said that music is a passport to happiness for Brazilians, an escape from everyday frustrations, and for many a hard and difficult material life. There's an amazing, magical, mystical quality to Brazilian music. Their music is paradise. And in the book, The Brazilian Sound by Chris McGowan and Ricardo Pestana, they say that Brazil arguably had more of an impact on international popular music than any country other than the United States. And Brazilian music, above all, has a profound ability to move the soul. In its sound and lyrics, it reflects the Brazilian people, their joy or despair, their remarkable capacity to celebrate, and the all-important concept of saudade, which doesn't have an English equivalent, but it means a kind of deep longing or yearning for something or someone. So where did Brazilian music come from? Like the musics of most of the Americas and the African diaspora, it is a combination, or a recombination, I should say, of elements coming out of Europe, indigenous elements, and a very strong foundation of African musical traditions. Some of the key elements of the magic that is Brazilian music include intense lyricism, which is part of the Portuguese musical heritage and the language Portuguese, because it's noted that Portuguese is one of the most musical tongues on the earth, and it's no small gift to a musician. But the real core of the magic of Brazilian music is the rhythm, which is definitely Afro-Brazilian and creates a vibrant and energizing style of music. When it comes to the indigenous influence, not a lot of scholarship has been done specifically on that, but we do know that there's a significant indigenous influence on some of the instruments used in Brazilian music, a variety of percussion instruments and styles of creating percussive types of effects. And so, as I mentioned, it doesn't play a visibly major role in the development of popular Brazilian music, but there are lots of examples of instrumentation that has been affected or influenced by the indigenous musical styles, such as the reco-reco or the scraper that is used in several types of musics. When it comes to the European influence, of course, the European tonal system, some of the Moorish scales that would have become part of Portuguese music because of the many hundreds of years that the Arabs and Moors occupied the Iberian Peninsula, and medieval European modes were transported to the Brazilian territory. The many Catholic festivals and many of the kind of dramatic performances that were a part of Portuguese culture also would have impacted music. And of course, many of the European instruments such as flutes, pianos, violins, guitars, etc., would have also been transmitted to the Brazilian space. Some of the genres of music that had influence on the early Brazilian genres would have been like the moda, which is a sentimental song and became the modinha in Brazil, the acalanto, a form of lullaby, the fofa, which was an 18th century dance, and early forms of fado, which continues to be the national music of Portugal, a kind of melancholy ballad. So let's turn to the African influence. Of course, one of the reasons why African musical traditions are so significant in Brazil is about numbers, right? And the impact of the slave trade in the Brazilian continent. From 1538 to about 1850, approximately 4.5 million people were enslaved from a variety of areas in West Africa, West and Southwest Africa, starting from as north as Senegal, going as far down as Angola. And Chris McGowan, in his book, The Brazilian Sound, says that in fact, Brazil has the largest African descended population outside of Africa itself, which you would have probably heard before. And enslavement in Brazil was also the last to be abolished in the Americas in 1888, which is only 125 years ago. But from a musical perspective, the African influence, again, because of the numbers of people and the consistent flow of people from the continent, kept the influence very fresh. And so the African influence has translated into Brazil's musical styles, the instruments that are used, the religious practices continue to inject or influence the secular music. There are language influences, and many popular musical antecedents would have come straight out of the continent. This drawing here is an arboreal representation done by one of the leaders of a group in an orchestra, actually, Orchestra Humpiles in Salvador, to kind of illustrate his understanding of the family of music. And so you see the roots are Jeje, Ketu, and Angola. Jeje is the name given to the nation that now is incorporated by Ghana and Benin, Ketu, Nigeria, or the Yoruba land, and Angola in the southwest of Africa. And of course, the trunk is candomblé, which is the religious, the traditional African religious practice that is very dominant in Brazil. And coming out of that, you see all the varieties, or some of the varieties, I should say, of music in the Brazilian Northeast. And interestingly, one of the branches there on my right-hand side says Caribeños y funk, and Caribeños means Caribbean. So they do acknowledge that a lot of these musics come out of, including our music, come out of the same heritage, as it were. So West African music and the diaspora's music share some similarities: dense textures, interlocking rhythms, complex rhythms, so significant polyrhythms, open-ended forms, structures based on ostinato patterns. Music definitely as a means of communal participation. And a lot of work recently has been done on the commonality of timelines, also known as, you might have heard of it as African bell patterns, or in the Spanish-speaking Latin America as La Clave. In West Africa, like in Ghana, up until today, it's also referred to as Kipan logo, and some people just refer to it as the groove. But it is this recurring pattern, percussive pattern that exists, that seems to keep repeating itself in music of the continent and the diaspora in many different variations, and we'll hear some of that as we go through. In terms of instruments, some of these instruments that are used very frequently in Brazilian music: the atabaque, which is a type of drum, the surdo drum, which is the larger one, the tamborim, the agogo, the cuica, which is, if you listen to samba from Rio in particular, there's a kind of squeaking sound, that's the cuica. The berimbau, which is this instrument here used during capoeira performances in particular, and the abe or shekere, which is this kind of percussive shaking instrument. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that a lot of the translations, or a lot of the music that makes its way into Brazilian popular music comes out of this religious social space known as the terreiro, right? When a lot of analysis is done of Brazilian music, you hear the rhythms that are particular to each orisha. So each orisha is called by a particular rhythm and song, and has unique musical scales and instrumentation, and we see that being utilized and translated into secular or popular music, as it were. Here's an example of two different rhythms, one to Ogun, the god of the Orisha war, and one to Yemanja, the Orisha of the sea, and you can hear the differences in the rhythms. And this would be one of the rhythms for the Orisha Yemanja, the sea. So you can tell the difference in the speed as well as in the pattern of the rhythm. And so for each Orisha, there would be differences connected to the Orisha's own properties and the things that they stand for. In terms of language, there are many words that have become part of the Brazilian vocabulary that are found in Brazilian music, and these are just a sample of some of them. I guess a linguist will probably be able to give you a complete list, but these are just some of the words that feature significantly in Brazilian music that have African antecedents. Two of the genres that are said to have preceded a lot of the contemporary genres are lundu and mashishi. Sorry for that typo there. Lundu is a form of African circle dance that preceded the samba, and is said to have been brought by the Bantu peoples that were enslaved from Angola. And the first recorded reference to it in Brazil is in 1780, so quite early. And it even made an appearance in the Portuguese court and was modified to suit European tastes. And by the mid-19th century, it could be found in many of the entertainment salons and on the streets in Europe. Mashishi is another genre that was created in Rio around 1880 and could be found in lower middle-class homes performed by Afro-Brazilians, and is said to be a synthesis of lundu, polka, which is a European genre, and Cuban habanera, and became internationally popular. Let's listen to some samples. This is Mashishi. And lundu. So those are the forms that, as I mentioned before, are credited as being the antecedents to samba. And of course, when you hear the word samba, the immediate association is with Brazil. And there's several reasons for that. I mean, outside of it being one of the most popular genres, it was consciously almost selected by the cultural and political elite to become a symbol, to represent all of Brazil's diversity and what you might have heard referred to as Brazil's quote unquote racial democracy, which we know is very complicated and controversial. So Dorival Caymmi was the first singer of the song Samba Da Minha Terra, and one of the lines of the song, he says, "He who doesn't like samba is not a good person or not a good guy. He's probably rotten in the head or sick in the feet," right? Meaning that it's impossible for you not to like samba. And over time, there have been many variations of samba that have emerged in the Brazilian soundscape. Samba de enredo, which is the samba used during Rio's Carnival, samba canção, pagode, samba de gafieira, samba de roda, and many other subgenres or combinations of samba with other types of music. And we'll try to look at a few today. So this is the song Samba da Minha Terra, or Samba of My Land. To samba, a declaration of samba's importance, cultural importance, social importance.
You interrupted my singing here, man.
Sorry, Mark. If I played every song here for about 3 hours, but
yeah, that's true.
Just to give everybody a taste. So let's move on to talk about the origins of samba. It's believed to be, the word samba is believed to be a Kimbundu word, Kimbundu coming out of the Congo-Angolan cultural heritage of West Africa, and referring to the music and gatherings or dances of Africans enslaved. It's believed to be a descendant of other musical forms, as I mentioned before, and its formation, as we know it today, is said to have taken place in Rio de Janeiro in the early 20th century, following the abolition of slavery in Brazil and the mass migration of many people who were formerly enslaved in the Northeast to the nation's capital at the time, which was Rio de Janeiro, right? And technically, it's a 2/4 meter with an emphasis on the second beat, a stanza and refrain structure, and interlocking syncopated lines. Its common roots, it has common roots, sorry, with predominant timelines in the African diaspora. So you will find significant similarities with other African bell patterns like clave, etc. But there really is no clear historical record of its evolution, just myths and stories around it. In terms of how it's told, the evolution of samba, there are some key elements in its formation. Concentrated settlement. So as I mentioned, this mass migration of people from the Northeast, which was the core of the plantation system in Brazil, down to the Southeast, to the capital at the time, Rio de Janeiro. And many formerly enslaved and free Afro-Brazilians settled in Rio de Janeiro in an era known as Praça 11 or Plaza 11 by 1915, that it was called Little Africa, right? A true Africa in miniature, less than 30 years after the abolition of slavery. So we're talking about a concentrated settlement of these people. And then the creation of social spaces by them. So you hear lots of stories and talks about the homes of old Bahian matriarchs who were called chias or aunts. For example, at a particular house 177, who are Visconde in Elma, is known as the home of Chia Siata, and she has become legend as the woman who facilitated the creation of samba as it is today. Because her house, she was a candomblé priestess. Her house was a terreiro, so where a lot of candomblé rituals took place, but it also was a place of encounter, a social space where people came and partied, or where there was always a pot on the fire and people came to get something to eat. And so Because of that, it became a place of cross-fertilization and experimentation, where not only people of African descent frequented, but many Euro-Brazilians also frequented this space. And because of that, there was a lot of mixing and discussion and experimentation with different musical styles, creating samba as we know it today. In his book, The Mystery of Samba, Emmanuel Viana says, in those vanished times of 1920s until almost 1930, samba was considered illegitimate. It was looked on as the stuff of low-life rascals, the carol of vagabonds. And that story is a very similar story to many other genres of music in the African diaspora. For example, in Trinidad, calypso was also considered to be pretty much the same thing, illegitimate and the music of, low-life people. And it's interesting how that migrates from that space or that perspective to becoming the national music of Brazil. So the crystallization of samba took its root with these men. The first group is called the Old Guard of Velha Guarda, and they are the people who experimented and created the basis for modern samba. Names like Pixinguinha, Donga, João da Baiana, Heitor dos Prazeres, Senhor, and Caninha. And then there was another group, a younger group of guys called the Estacio crew, who differentiated samba musically a little bit in 1928, and actually responsible for the creation of the first samba schools. Men like Ishmael da Silva, Bide, Milton Bastos, and Armando Massal. Let's hear a little bit of the music that they created in the early 1900s. So Pelo Telefone is considered the first samba that was actually recorded.
Pelo telefone, samba carnavalesco, gravado por Baiano e o Corpo de Coros, para a Casa Edson, Rio de Janeiro. O chefe da folia pelo telefone manda me avisar que com alegria não se questione para se brincar. Ai, 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 é deixar mágoas pra trás, oh rapaz. Ai, 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 fica triste se é capaz de velar.
And the story behind that song is really interesting. It is said that Chia Siata, the lady I mentioned, whose house was the meeting place, she was so important culturally and socially in Rio that she was one of the few women in that area that had a telephone. And because practicing candomblé and African traditional practices were also considered illegitimate and not good, the police many times raided those spaces. And because she had a telephone, the police chief would call her to let her know when they were coming by so that she could shut down things. Very interesting. And this song is by the Estacio crew, Ishmael Silva, Se Você Jurar, which continues to be a classic in the Brazilian samba space today. And that clip is actually from a film about the life of Noel Rosa, another significant person in the early samba days. Samba Canção was another important variation of samba, as I mentioned, because it was almost the second phase of samba when it was becoming more acceptable or accepted by the middle and upper classes in Brazil. Some of the names that are significant with this type of samba, which started to become a little more melodic and a little more sophisticated in their eyes, less harsh in their eyes. Mario Hayes, Francisco Alves, Carmen Miranda, who made a name for herself in Hollywood. Noel Rosa, who I just mentioned, Ari Barroso, who was the singer of Aquarela do Brasil, which considers to be one of the kind of representative songs of Brazil up until today, and Dorival Caymmi, who sang Samba My Land. So let's hear some examples. Carmen Miranda, I'm sure you would have heard of her.
O meu ganza faz tica-tica-bum-tic, pra eu cantar o tica-tica-bum.
She's not very popular in Brazil with Brazilians because she was Portuguese, first of all. And many Brazilians consider her to be kind of like a fraud, representing an image of Brazil that was not accurate, but that was exaggerated and, took bits and pieces and created something a bit kitsch. And Aquarela do Brasil, I'm sure you will recognize. That's a classic, as I mentioned, and many times used to represent Brazil in all kinds of settings. So there was a pushback. There was a movement to push back against Samba Canção and that kind of whitewashing of Samba to bring it back to its original days. And so the descendants of the original Sambistas, who were forced to move to the hills, the morros around Rio de Janeiro, wanted to keep up the original musical integrity of Samba. So you had artists like Zequeti, Cartola, Nelson Cavaquinho, and many others who tried to preserve the original qualities of Samba.
Onde sacode carola, quando aquele de babando faz, babando um jogo de cena, carola, e minha com teu sapateado de babado e coisa e tal, mas de sacode carola, e eu quero ver sacudir, mete, remete por cento, carola inteiro, papai de Rafael.
So you can hear the very percussive, acoustic nature of Samba. The use of the pandeiro, the hand drum, is significant in Samba especially. And so today there continues to be a younger generation who preserves the style of Samba and of course adds their own flavor. And there are lots of modern variations as well. So pagode Samba, pop Samba. There's the Lapa resistance with people like Teresa Cristina, Ana Costa, Nilce Carvalho, etc., who are trying to keep Samba as in its traditional forms as well. So you have a variety of groups still producing and performing Samba up until today. Some samples, modern Samba or contemporary.
Não sei como aconteceu, dava tudo pra saber onde você se escondeu. Tô pensando em escrever uma carta de amor em forma de coração, ou quem sabe lhe dizer que a nossa união foi.
Modern, I can only speak for myself, but Samba, I don't know, it does something to the heartstrings. It has an emotional effect. I don't know if you feel the same way, Marcus. That's an example of pagode samba.
É na nevada do Partido Alto. Vamos que vamos, vamos que vamos. E a galera na palma da mão, compadre. Olha a palma da mão, vem comigo, vem. Olha a palma da mão, vem comigo, vem. Olha a palma da mão, vem comigo, vem. Eu vou botar teu nome na macumba. Vou procurar uma feiticeira, fazer uma quizumba pra te derrubar. Oi, ai, ai. Você me jogou um feitiço, quase que eu morri. Eu sei o que eu sofri. Deus me perdoe, mas vou me vingar.
And of course, you know, samba is a music of connected to Africa, so it's always a music to dance to in most cases.
Oh, 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 alô, bandeirinha!
And Brazilians have a penchant for live music. It was a shock to me that even a lot of recorded music is recorded live music. They prefer to listen to live music, to hear music that is performed rather than music that is, you know, altered in the studio and pristine. They have a penchant for live music, which is interesting. So lots has been said about samba and why it's the essence of Brazil. You know, samba is the artistic landmark that symbolizes an interracial, happy, and cultural Brazil. John Charles Chastain said in The Mystery of Samba that samba is a great metaphor for Brazil's racial mixture. Brazilians without a trace of African ancestry proudly claim something African in their sensibility. And the discourse on mestizagem or mixing is the basis for dominant narratives of national identity and celebrates samba and other Afro-Brazilian cultural forms as symbols of Brazilianness and racial democracy. And no sooner had samba de morro been invented than it became the very emblem of a pure and ancient Brazilian essence, uncontaminated by outside influences. Preserving this musical essence became tantamount to preserving the Brazilian soul. And so in the imagination of Brazilians, samba represents what it means to be Brazilian. So the next genre I wanted to touch on is bossa nova, which is one of the genres that emerged out of samba and has had a lot of international focus. Bossa nova, which means a new way, is the flip side of the coin to samba de morro, or traditional samba in Rio de Janeiro, right? It came out of a new generation's response to the watered down commerciality of samba canção by the likes of Carmen Miranda in the 1940s and 50s. And it was ushered into the musical world by João Gilberto, who is actually Bahian, by his song Chega de Saudade and Bim Bom in 1958. Many Brazilians found that this new style was a bit unconventional, that the vocals were a bit unusual, and it was too close. It sounded like it had a lot of American jazz influence. And then Desafinado by Tom Jobim was released a few months later and started to kind of become an anthem for this new emerging move of music. What also helped was a film done by Marcel Camus, a French director, Orfeu Negro, or Black Orpheus in 1959. And why did it help? Because the entire soundtrack for the film was written by a lot of these bossa nova artists, and the music was in the bossa nova style. The film won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, and Manhã de Carnaval became an international hit, which is, I'm sure, a song that you all know. The backdrop to bossa nova, why did it happen? It was a new time in Brazil. The future was bright for many middle-class Brazilians. The country had just popularly, democratically elected a new president, Juscelino Kubitschek, in 1956. They were now building a new capital in Brasilia, so moving the capital from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia in Goiás state. The national football team won World Cup in Sweden for the first time in 1958, so it was a great source of pride. Lots of things were going on. So it was a culturally and socially a very positive time for many Brazilians, and that translated into the music. Bossa Nova.
And Sean,
Yes.
so far so that Juscelino could be checked about the nickname, the Bossa Nova president.
Okay, I did not know that. That's good to
Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
We call them Presidente Bossa Nova.
Que interessante. So where did Bossa Nova come from? The roots of Bossa Nova, as I mentioned before, is in samba, and its variations have influences from lots of other Brazilian genres from around the country, baião, bolero, marcha, etc. And as I mentioned, João Gilberto came to be known as the Pope of Bossa Nova because he was the person whose music kind of introduced it to the national scene. But Tom Jobim, cites modern classical music and some composers like Heitor Villa-Lobos as major influences on the work. And of course, there's some talk about American West Coast jazz also having an influence. But Chris McGowan says that this new musical vanguard would find a spiritual and professional center in Rio de Janeiro's most famous neighborhood, Copacabana. And of course, a lot of the people who ended up becoming Bossa Nova artists would have been people living in Zona Sul in Rio and, spending a lot of their time at bars and clubs and that kind of thing in those neighborhoods. And this is just a map of Rio, Zona Sul, to show you some of the neighborhoods that would have been included, like Leblon, Ipanema, Apuador, Copacabana, of course, Botafogo, etc. People who lived in this part of the city who usually tended to be middle or upper class. Who are the key people in this movement? Of course, Antonio Carlos Jobim, who came to be known as Tom Jobim or Bon Tom. He was born in 1927 from Rio de Janeiro and lived in Ipanema, trained in piano under a German teacher based in Brazil. And he became so popular in this movement that the airport in Rio de Janeiro is named after him today. And a lot of his music is still, very representative of Brazilian music in general. And he has tons of music, right? And of course, this is his most famous song.
Tall and tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking, and when she passes, each one she passes goes, ah.
Everybody knows that one, right? The girl from Ipanema. Vinicius de Moraes is also important in this movement. He was a lyricist, so he wrote a lot of the words, the lyrics for the songs, over 200 songs. And focused a lot on elemental themes, especially love, but also wrote books and poems and whatnot, and was involved in the soundtrack for Orfeu Negro, and was referred to himself as the blackest white man in Brazil, right? He was a practitioner of Candomblé, a son of Shango, and so that was a heavy influence on the music that he wrote. João Gilberto, who I mentioned, was a native of Bahia. And it is said that he brought the rhythm and the beat to Bossa Nova. Of course, coming from a space like Bahia, he would have grown up in a space that was full of rhythm and surrounded by it in every space. And he brought a new way of singing that blended the volume of the voice and the instrument, which is very characteristic of Bossa Nova. A sample of his first song, Chega de Saudade.
Vai minha tristeza e diz a ela que sem ela não pode ser. Diz-lhe numa prece que ela regresse, porque eu não posso mais sofrer. Chega de saudade, a realidade é que sem ela não há paz, não há beleza, é só tristeza e a melancolia que não sai de mim, não sai de mim, não sai.
A Bossa Nova. Other key personalities, Baden Powell de Aquino, born in Rio de Janeiro, and is said to have brought the mastery of the guitar to bossa nova and collaborated heavily with some of the others. Samba de Canção is one of his most popular songs that went on to be covered many, many times, and he eventually moved to Europe. And there was an American invasion, as tends to happen sometimes, right? The Americans got wind of this bossa nova movement, and American jazz artists fell in love with the sound of it. Stan Getz was involved in doing an album, bringing Astrid Gilberto to the United States. Desafinado made the Billboard Top 20 for pop singles, sold hundreds of thousands of copies and whatnot. And there was a legendary concert at Carnegie Hall in 1962, where all of these Brazilian artists presented bossa nova music in the United States. And that made it take off even more. When US artists started recording bossa-inspired tunes like Ella Fitzgerald and Quincy Jones's big band Bossa Nova, which is known for being the soundtrack of that film. What is that film called again? I'll remember in a second, but this is a song. I'm sure many of you have heard that song and never thought that it was connected to bossa nova, but yes, it is. So in 1964, there was a military coup in Brazil, which toppled the Brazilian government and replaced it with an authoritarian regime. And that sort of changed the orientation of bossa nova from just being about love and nature and whatnot. And a lot of the singers started singing protest songs instead. Many singers left Brazil if they could, and or might have been outside of Brazil because of its popularity in the United States, like Sergio Mendes, and just ended up staying there. And Sergio Mendes' hit album in 1966 called Brazil 66 kind of propelled bossa nova even further there, and I'm sure you all know his rendition of the song. Talk about Brazilian music being magical, that's one of the songs that comes to mind. So because of the military coup and the shift in focus, a movement emerged called the Tropicalia movement. And this movement would have an impact on Brazilian music because it was focused on a different kind of sound. It arose in the late 1960s, and bossa nova began to fade due to the exodus of many of its leading figures. It fused Brazilian forms with a lot of foreign influences, especially rock and roll from the United States and the UK, for example. And so most of the music was countercultural, rebellion type music, very much comparative to American protest songs. But it was a significant period because this music would have marked impacts on the music that followed in future years. One of the key songs done by Caetano Veloso, who was a young man at the time and was actually exiled from Brazil, is a song that's referenced many times. Quick sample.
A mãe da Virgem diz que não, e o anúncio da televisão, e estava escrito no portão, e o maestro ergueu o dedo, e além da porta ao porteiro sim, e eu digo não, e eu digo não ao não, e eu digo proibido, proibido, proibido.
So you can hear the clear influence of rock and roll in the guitars, for example. So we move now from the locus in the southeast in Rio de Janeiro to the northeast a bit. Baião is one of the significant musics of the northeast, and it comes out of another genre called xochi, which is said to be a combination of genres, mostly Afro-Brazilian music mixed with or influenced by other genres. Baião is similar to xochi, but has a softer, more Afro-Brazilian rhythm and a more clearly defined dance backbeat. And it's believed to have been developed in the early 19th century out of the Lundu music that we saw earlier. And Baião compositions often have a somewhat sad or melancholic undertone connected to some of the realities of life in the northeast of Brazil. And basic instruments, usually an accordion, a guitar, a fiddle sometimes. And the man who kind of made this music popular nationally is Luis Gonzaga, known as the King of Baião. Coming out of Baião is another genre today that's pretty popular called forró. And forró is an umbrella term for several kinds of related styles, right? And there are lots of stories about where the name came from. Some people say that forró is a Brazilianized version of the words for all, music for all in English. Some people say it comes from Hungarian. Some people say it comes from another word, forró bodô, which means a great party. But it comes from the northeast of Brazil, in Pernambuco in particular. And there's several dance styles that have emerged out of this umbrella genre of music, nordestino, universitario, etc. And there are many groups who've made this music popular nationally and even outside of Brazil. So this is a sample of Luis Gonzaga and Baião.
Alguém mandou ser o que sou e o que gosta. Não sei quem sou e vou mudar.
So all of this music,
A ser aquilo que eu...
music to dance. Brazilian popular music, also known as MPB, what is that? Música Popular Brasileira. It is an umbrella term, basically known as the biggest genre within Brazilian music because it incorporates everything else that can't be categorized into another genre, right? It's neither traditional folk music, doesn't fit into any other clearly defined genre, but brings together all elements of various Brazilian music styles and usually is urban-based music. Some of the key artists in this movement would have started out in other movements. Maria Bethânia, Elis Regina, who started in Bossa Nova, Jorge Ben, Caetano Veloso, who started in Tropicalia, and many others. But some of the key artists are the most significant representatives of Brazilian music today. So Nana and Dori Caymmi, who are the children of Dorival Caymmi, who sang Samba of My Land. And one of their most famous songs was actually covered by Sarah Vaughan, Like a Lover. Gilberto Gil, who was known as Ubaiano, the Bahian, and got his start in the Tropicalia movement. He went on to become the Minister of Culture under the Lula da Silva government in 2002, a sample of one of his most famous songs.
Toda menina baiana tem santo que Deus dá. Toda menina baiana tem encanto que Deus dá. Toda menina baiana tem jeito que Deus dá. Toda menina baiana tem defeito também que Deus dá.
Caetano Veloso, who I mentioned before, who was very good friends with Gilberto Gil and was involved in the Tropicalia movement, and up until today continues to be a significant figure in Brazilian music. Jorge Benjor, cultural icon that is known for fusing lots of different styles together, was known to create something called the transcontinental Afro groove, and a lot of his music is music that we know. Like, he was the first person to sing Mas Que Nada in 1963. That was then redone by Sergio Mendes. And he has lots of other significant music that has been copied. So, for example, his song Taj Mahal was covered by Rod Stewart and renamed to You Think I'm Sexy in 1965. Yeah, a very significant artist on the Brazilian music scene. Javan, who's one of the last big MEPB stars to be introduced by Brazil's music festival system. So there was a festival system where there would be a competition. So people would go and perform, and then whoever won would usually get some kind of opportunity for promotion. He was one of the most popular 1980s artists in Brazil and forged a kind of sophisticated, rhythmically vibrant Pan-American style. And his music, his voice is one of a kind. Sample of him. And there are lots of new people on the scene who continue MEPB. Marisa Monte, Maria Rita, Bebel Gilberto, Ana Carolina, Vanessa da Mata, Seu Jorge, many others that you can check out if you would like to explore this genre. And so to wind up, I wanted to present a sample. So these are the big jefes, if you want to call them that, in Brazilian music: samba, bossa nova, MEPB, etc. are the huge genres that have significant impact across the national music landscape in Brazil. But there are some regional genres that manage to do the same thing coming out of specific spaces in the country. Let's take a look at a few of those. We're going to look at lambada, axé, clube de esquina, and carioca funk. Lambada, also known as the Forbidden Dance, came from Pará, the state of Pará in Brazil, and the dance became internationally popular in the 1980s around Latin America and even in the Caribbean. I'm sure some of you all remember it, right? Lambada has adopted aspects of dances, many other dances, such as forró and even salsa and merengue from the Caribbean, etc., and had transformations of the form through mixing with Caribbean music and whatnot. Even the song that came to be representative of lambada, performed by the French group Kaoma, actually came from Bolivia, which is a good example of the mixing and the cross-fertilization. And I'm sure you remember the song. Lambada's international appeal continues up until today. So today, very little lambada music is produced, but the style of dancing lambada is now being combined with zouk music. So it's being called zouk lambada, and people are using lambada steps accompanied to zouk music all around the world, and it's a huge craze in Europe today. And even American artists like Jennifer Lopez and Pitbull sampled that same lambada song by Kauma in their hit On the Floor a couple years ago. The other genre I wanted to present is Ashe, also known as the Bahian sound. Ashe's roots, they come out of the 1980s and 1990s in the city of Salvador in Bahia. The word Ashe is the Yoruba word for life force or positive energy. And this refers to a kind of umbrella term for several styles, including samba reggae. But generally, they are styles that mix a bunch of influences. Samba, Ijesha, which comes out of Candomblé, Frevo, which comes from Recife, reggae from Jamaica, and other elements, including even salsa, merengue, even soca and calypso. And it was developed for the carnival scene in Salvador, basically, and was the result of a kind of re-Africanization of the Bahian music scene in the 1970s. The first song that was considered to be Ashe in 1985 was a song by Luis Caldas called Fricoche. And he is considered to be the forerunner of Ashe and possibly its first hit. There's also another artist, Sarah Jenny, and her song Ahoda, 2 samples.
Nega do cabelo duro, que não gosta de pentear. Quando passa na marcha do tubo, o negão começa a gritar. Olha a nega do cabelo duro.
And Sarah Jenny's Ahoda. And there were many other bands that followed. Chiclete com Banana, Banda Eva, and many others. Olodum, which you may have heard of, introduced samba reggae. But in all of these artists' music, rhythm was always key. The melodies were simple, and it was energetic music for partying. Lyrics usually focus on sex or romance and carnival. And in the 1990s, there were some pop versions of Samba de Roda, traditional Samba de Roda, which emerged by groups like Jara Samba, Companhia do Pagode, etc. And of course, dance being central to all of this, dance movement came from a variety of sources and tended to be choreographed and aerobic-like to kind of encourage people to be able to participate in the songs.
Requebrar, requebrar, requebrar sim. Pode falar, pode rir de mim. Requebrar, requebrar, requebrar sim. Pode falar, pode rir de mim.
That was one of the first classics by Olodum, and of course you could hear the high level of percussion, the emphasis on percussion with Olodum and Jara Samba.
Toque nasce torto, nunca se direita, menina que requebra mãe, pega na cabeça. Toque nasce torto, nunca se direita, menina que requebra mãe, pega na cabeça. Domingo ela não vai, ela não vai, vai. Comigo ela não vai, não. Vai, vai, vai.
I remember my first trip to Brazil in 1999, and this music was everywhere, and how intoxicating it was to go into a space and the music was playing and everybody was dancing the same thing. It was absolutely energetic and fun. For somebody my age, I guess. Some of the key people in this movement of Ashe, Daniela Mercury, who drew all of Brazil's attention to Ashe music and is called the Queen of Ashe today, born in Salvador and sang backup for many bands. In 1991, her release Swingy da Cor, or The Swing of Color, became a bestseller in Brazil. She performed in Sao Paulo on Avenida Paulista and totally blocked everything. Like, police had to come to facilitate traffic. There were people everywhere. She took Bahian music to the rest of Brazil. A sample of Swingy da Cor.
Não, não me abandone, não me desespere. Por quê? Porque eu não posso ficar sem você. Oi, não, não, não. Não me desespere, porque eu não posso ficar sem você. Eu não posso ficar sem você, porque eu não posso ficar sem te ver.
And Margarete Menezes, who took samba reggae internationally since her debut album in 1988, her songs tended to focus a lot more on African pride and African culture, and she took Ashe abroad and paved the way for many artists as well. Eligible, her first hit, which was an uplifting hymn to an ancient Yoruba city.
Elegibô, cidade encantada, elegibô, sua majestade real. Araqueto, ritual do candomblé, exalta as cidades de Queto e Sabé. Ferido vingou-se o homem, utilizando seus poderes. Passaram-se anos difíceis, sofreram muitos seres. Os vassalos ficaram sem pasto, a pau e a fora não brotavam mais. As mulheres ficaram estéreis, a flor do seu sexo não se abrirá jamais. Ele
And Carlinhos Brown and Chimbalada, we can't leave out, one of the most prolific songwriters today across Brazil. And he was, he got his name when he was at a party and someone asked his friends, who is that guy like James Brown? And so he took the last name Brown. He trained under one of the masters of samba, became part of Caetano Veloso's band, wrote songs for him, and then developed Chimbalada. His first album was released in 1996. And up until today, he continues to do significant work in that space. Banda Eva and Ivete Sangalo, we cannot forget, because Ivete is one of the biggest Brazilian stars today. Her music is known across the Brazilian landscape, but she started off with Banda Eva, who was connected to a carnival organization in Salvador. She's become the most commercially successful Ashe music performer ever. And her some of her songs like Chiki Chiki Tak have been covered in many different languages as far and as strange as Russian. This is a sample of that song. So the last two genres we're going to look at Clube de Esquina, the corner club. It comes out of the state of Minas Gerais. and was a Brazilian music artist collective who mixed rock and roll, progressive rock, bossa nova, jazz styles with Brazilian country music and all kinds of stuff. But it became a kind of sad, wistful folk music. And why it's important is because of their engaging compositions, their patchwork of songs and poetic richness. And one of the key artists to come out of the movement who's significant on the Brazilian landscape is a gentleman named Milton Nascimento. And one of his most well-known songs, Tudo Que Você Podia Ser, really embodies Clube de Esquina and that kind of wistful sadness. A quick sample here.
Com sol e chuva, você sonhava que ia ser melhor depois. Você queria ser o grande herói das estradas, tudo que você queria ser.
And the last genre we look at, so we've made a full circle. We started in Rio, we went up north, and we've come back to Rio de Janeiro. Funk Carioca started in the bailes funk, or funk dances, popular since the 1970s and featured in things like the movie City of God's Adjunct. Funkeiros are typically Afro-Brazilian, lower class from the suburbs, and they have these competitions between groups known as galeras. And in the 1990s, funk karaoke became nationally popular and eventually internationally. And today continues to be. There have been lots of new artists on the scene like MC Kevinho, Ludmilla, etc. And usually it's a genre that depicts or describes some of the realities of living in favelas, the violence, drug dealing, criminals, etc. So two quick samples, one by Ludmilla, a female artist.
Boom, 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 boom. Foca no meu, só no meu, só no meu. Foca no meu bumbum. Aqui é só trabalho lindo, mas por cima tá rindo. Eu já matei mais um, eu já matei mais um.
And MC Kevin.
E aí, é Kevin Jorginho novamente. Quem diria, hein? É o novo hit do verão, pra geral curtir. Ela joga o bum.
So throughout, we've talked a lot about Brazilian music and tried to do a quick survey of the many different types of music that exist in Brazil. But what about the connections between Brazilian music and music throughout the diaspora, including the Caribbean? Well, I wanted to show you all the, where that has been in the past and where it is now. So I'm sure many of you might recognize this song. Released in So that is a song, Give Me the Thing, which I'm sure many of you all know, released by Lord Kitchener here in Trinidad in 1983. You can imagine my shock when I heard this song, released in Brazil, in Bahia, as Ashe music, 3 years later in 1986.
Hey,
abaixo e protetor. Toda amiga faz amor com ele, toda branca tem maior tesão. Arerê de confusão na pele, sem chuva e abaixo e protetor. Balduíno guerrear, é gigante de samba.
It's basically a carbon copy. I'm not sure what the story is there, but I'm trying to find out. And of course, we know songs like Bahia Girls that was done by David Rudder that draws on inspiration from the Bahian context. And artists like Jimmy Cliff, who collaborated with Olodum to do covers of No Woman, No Cry by Bob Marley. But even up until today in the contemporary period, there continues to be collaboration, cross-fertilization between Brazilian artists and artists across the diaspora. And these are two examples. Anita and a collaboration with Cardi B and Latin artist from the Caribbean, Mike Towers, I think his name is.
Go. A mí me gusta every time you look at me that way. A mí me gusta all the dirty things you need every day. A mí me gusta en cada detalle que te hago y que me haces bien. It's what I like, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just what I like, yeah. A mí me gusta la mujeres when they shake that, yeah, yeah, yeah. A mí me gusta when they want, they go and get it, yeah, yeah, yeah. A mí me gusta, a mí me gusta, a mí me gusta.
So, of course, Cardi B is part Caribbean. Mike Towers is from Puerto Rico, I believe. And then the backbeat of this song is Carioca Funk, which is the genre we just listened to that comes out of Rio. And a collaboration between this year between Ludmilla, who's a Carioca Funk artist, and Mr. Vegas, who's Jamaican.
Mr. Vegas, topa la mascara, sexy Lunila, ai, 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 ai.
Olha só quem chegou, bebê, a tropa da Ludmilla. Hoje eu vou botar pra beber, joga tudo nesse clima. Toma, 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 soca, dona. Toma, toma, só senta, dona. Toma, toma, só soca, dona. Toma, toma, só senta, dona. Toma, toma, só soca, dona.
So we can see that historically, Brazil and the rest of the African diaspora has had a long relationship of being inspired by each other, you know, cross-fertilization, sometimes copying, sometimes collaboration, sometimes. But why is that the case? That's the case because, you know, the music has a common source, and the vibe, the groove that is embedded in all the musics of the diaspora appeal to and connect with us, all of us. So that makes for that kind of inspiration and cross-fertilization to happen very easily. Thanks, folks. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Sean. Very, very interesting. I know the task you received from me is humongous. You had a lot to do, and to cover Brazilian music is not easy at all, given its complexity, the size of Brazil. And there are also other styles like the gaucho music, the pantaneiro music, the Amazonian music, the sertanejo music. That also, they don't have Afro-Brazilian influences, but they also exist. So that was not the purpose here today, of course not. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and giving us samples of it as well. I was a bit afraid that you would not mention Milton Nascimento, my favorite singer, but you did, because I consider him having one of the most beautiful voices that are available in Brazilian music, along with Elis Regina, who was also part from MPB. Yeah, so thank you very much. I will open the floor immediately to our people here. I am pretty sure they have some questions. So who would like to ask Sean some questions here? Please go ahead, feel free.
Good night.
Yes,
This is Len.
I was expecting you to come with a question.
Well, there are not many questions. I just want to tell him thank you, first of all. I enjoyed that totally, and I can understand why you would take 2 weeks to cover most of that, because there's so much that isn't there that I would like to ask you about as well, but that would take us the whole night. So I just want to touch on a few things.
Sure.
The ostinato patterns, or the pan logo, the bell patterns. I think there needs to be some study of that. I've read a few studies online, and the reason why you kept mentioning heartbeat all the time. Now, from my standpoint, I'm not a musician. I understand. I'm a scientist. I understand music mathematically.
Right.
So those 5 notes, those 5 beats, sometimes they're grouped as 3 and 2, or for the classical clave, and then you have the triseo, which is 3 notes played, and then 3 notes played at the time of 2, which is the same 5 again.
Yeah.
Now, some musicologists have argued that that really resembles diastole and systole, their heartbeat. So it goes back to link to what you were saying. That is why the music is so catchy. It is the rhythm of a human being, those 5 notes, because it's in sync with our heartbeat and our natural ability to move.
Yes.
And some exploration needs to be done of that, because there's that is the vehicle or the DNA that travels throughout all of the world, or carried the music throughout the world. The 5-note pattern even has an Anansi story that was used in ancient days to teach children the rhythm. It's called 2 ways to count to 10, because you make a musical sentence by repeating the same 5 notes again and again and again. So 2 ways to count to 10, you play the 5 notes, you play them again, you play them again. So all and all like that. It is a very, very important aspect of music, world music, because for Africans to even claim it on their own is, yes, it is African, but it is the vehicle by which we were able to get back what was taken from us as we were brought naked from Africa. We had that in our head and our bodies, the rhythm. So I would like to see at some point, I think somebody write a paper or do a video on those African ostinato patterns, those pan logo bells, because those are the vehicles.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you taught me a lot this evening, because I know of the orishas, but I didn't know each orisha had its own rhythm pattern.
Yes.
That in itself is interesting. And you didn't get around to talk about the contribution of the Cape Verde influences, the batuque, and so on. That isn't, yes, you see, and that again is a triseo, because it is a clap. But I've seen whole orchestras play music based off of the batuque. So it has a lot of complexity to it as well. I didn't know about the Zoche music, but you didn't get into Sharo a lot, the Sharo music a lot, because that in itself, if you have been led to Brazilian music via jazz, so when I got there then, and I wanted to find more and more and more and more, you got Scott Joplin, and then you got Sharo, and you realize, oh, okay, it's very similar. And then you got into the Sharo, and it's, excuse me,
yeah,
the Sharo of itself is like a misunderstanding of the word, because it is a form of Brazilian blues, the blue, they could call it as such. But the word really comes from an old African word, jolo, means dance or something like that. I'm not even sure myself. But it's like somebody got mixed up, and I called sorrow, which is blues. They came to the same conclusion via probably the wrong route. But all in all, it is extremely beautiful. And when I first heard it, I thought this was classical, but then I heard rhythm in it, and I said, but what is it exactly? And it was danceable, and it became so exciting that as much as I came to the music via jazz and the samba and all that, I'm completely hooked on everybody from Ernesto Nazareth, Villalobos, you name it. I'm hooked on those guys, because that music in itself is very soothing. And Villalobos was here in Barbados at some point in time as well.
Okay.
And he wrote some interesting music.
Yeah.
But yes, and that's why what has me so excited about your presentation. It is interesting. It taught me a few new things about some of these persons that I've been listening to, and I've written it down. So I'm going to be doing some exploration on the internet shortly on some of these persons here and the types of music. But thank you very much. You know, it was interesting hearing you.
You're welcome. It's actually interesting that you mentioned Sholo because I had it as part of my presentation. And then when I realized I had like 100 slides, I had to cut it down. And so I had to make some decisions as to what to exclude. And Sholo was one of the genres that I excluded.
Yes, because that's the tango, the machiti, and the lundu. The way how you present it, I understood how the lundu and the tango then, because you can see the movement. You can see how the origin of one from the next. But you see Europeans doing these dances, so you kind of wonder, wait, is it African? Is it Portuguese? What is it exactly? It seems to be a perfect blend because we thought that all African music is drumming in fast rhythms all the time. But we never kind of got the concept that a lot of it was the slow, soulful music as well in there as well. And singing as well, choral singing.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you.
And by the way, I have a Quaker and a berimbau here at home, and I have logo bells and clavier sticks and all that. So I have my piece of Brazil here at home.
Wonderful. Okay, so do we have other contributions? Other questions? Thank you, Len.
Good evening, guys. Again, sorry I'm late. It sounds like I missed a huge chunk of a fascinating presentation. Very basic question, not as knowledgeable as Len and all these things. My question is, in what language do these people sing? I'm sure you mentioned it, but you said I came in late. Zouk obviously is everything is done in Creole. What is it a similar thing where it is done in a dialect kind of thing, and obviously then it varies from region to region?
All the other genres of music, you mean? No, generally it's in Portuguese across the board. Yeah, one of the things that some of the early Brazilian governments were successful at was instituting Portuguese across as a sort of glue to hold all of these diverse spaces together, because really and truly it is probably one of the few things that maintains Brazil as a country. You know, there's such a wide diversity between the north and the south, the east and the west, that one of the few things that kind of keep them together is the Portuguese language. Of course, you will have some variations in terms of region-specific vocabulary, particular words or expressions, but generally it's Portuguese.
That is
and some accents as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Bo. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, good evening. Are you all hearing me? Yes. I really enjoyed the presentation and I get it now. I understand why you love Brazilian culture and music so much. It was like a mini concert, and there were times I felt a lot of nostalgia. And that Kitchener Gimini thing, I was like, whoa. I mean, I wasn't expecting a Brazilian version at all. And I get it now. I understand how our Trimbigonian rhythms and African and Brazilian music all fit together. You know, I get it now. And the way you took us on this musical journey, I think it was really effective in that, you know, the best way to teach is to show and not just tell.
Right.
So the presentation really came to life. So thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, any other contribution? No? Okay, so we will be back next week. Next week, it is foreseen that we will have a person specialist in cultural studies to talk about Afro-Brazilian religions, okay? So we will have that as topic. If you're interested, please come back the same address at 6 p.m. Barbados time. So, Sean, any final remarks?
Just that I think, you know, as Aisha was saying, one of the one of the first parts of Brazilian culture that captured me was its music. And I remember when I was, before I even went to Brazil the first time, when I was going to school in New York and just listening to Brazilian artists, I felt at home. Brazilian music was home for me in many ways, and because of its diversity, its richness, its melodic, diversity and richness as well. It really is. I think anybody who loves music, Brazilian music, is worth delving into and exploring. And just some of the names that I called today, just type them into YouTube and explore some of the music that they have. As Chris McGowan says, I don't think there's any other country outside of the US that has had the impact musically on a global scale than Brazil. So yeah, that's my final thoughts.
I agree with that. So Brazilian music is home to me as well. When I hear Brazilian music, I'm at home no matter where I am. Yes. Okay. So once again, for this second and with a wonderful presentation, Sean, thank you very much in the name of the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing this with us. So we will be back next week. I hope you can join us again. I say to all, boa noite, good night, and ciao.
Boa noite.
Boa noite, obrigada.
Boa noite.
Okay, bye-bye.